Thank you to Sundance for hosting and putting together this illustrious group. 3 exceptional new movies are represented on this panel. I've had the joy and pleasure and I have deep gratitude at being able to see all 3 of them before the festival. And I encourage you to see all of them. I think it is an interesting place to start to talk about kind of just the notion of adaptation and the inherent challenges that come from that. Or as someone who doesn't write films, I write differently. Maybe that challenge is in my head. Maybe as writers for the screen, you don't see that as challenges. Maybe that's the first place to start. Is there an inherent challenge in immersing yourself in the work of another writer and adapting it for this medium, for the cinema? Is there a daunting aspect to that? Is there what do you see as anybody can start? I don't know.
Well, so I read this book called Wildlife by Richard Ford probably in 2011 and read it many times in the course of a year and sort of really thought about why me and why would I try to make a film, inspired by this or adapting this and when I wrote him, he immediately gave me a gift, which I sort of wish every author would do for any filmmaker, which was, he said, my book's my book and your picture's your picture. Yeah. And I think you'd be doing both of us a disservice if you don't make what is you.
He said, leave the book where it is, it's safest there.
Which is true. But he was very generous, and that is also...
Not all writers do that, or not writers maybe could do that.
Maybe not, yeah. And that is also what I wanted, which was not to try to make something wildly different from the book intentionally, or exactly like the book intentionally, but to let it be the film, whatever that is going to be, which I didn't totally know at that point, but... so that was a really good place to start.
Well, so we'll talk in a minute about the process that the 2 of you embarked upon to actually adapt the book. But why don't we take a half step back since you guys went first? Why did you embark on this project? What about the book spoke to you? But maybe even before that, what about this author inspired you to pick up the book in the first place? Did you know what it was about before you picked it up? Why did you pick it up? What did it speak to?
Yeah.
And do you remember how old you were when you read it? Were you young? Were you?
I read Wildlife in 2011. I'd read some stuff of Richard Ford's previously, the sports writer, and then a book of short stories called Rock Springs, which I really liked, and the type of language that's in Rock Springs is a particular type of writing that I really just respond to, which is it's just sort of spare but huge somehow, and somebody, I think maybe had said, or just by reading the first page in a bookstore, I realized this other book is called Wildlife was also written in that type of language, and so I think I just read the book. I'm not sure why.
Well, also you had been reading a lot of Montana writers.
A lot of Northwest stuff for some reason. I like that part.
An unknown reason? I mean, were you looking to that part of the country for a reason, or you just?
I guess I like it, and spiritually I like it. So whether it's like Jim Harrison or Richard Brodigan there just seems to be a lot of writing I like from that part of the world, the Northwest.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the language he uses? I haven't read Wildlife, so I'd be curious to know a little bit more about that language.
Well, I'd hate to talk about his writing.
Fair
like,
enough.
you talked
about it being spare.
I'll tell you what I ultimately sort of said to what I responded to in it, which I felt represented me as well, and something I passed on to some of my collaborators, which was, my goal was sort of to make something like sushi, which is like, looks really simple, but is actually very complex, and that's the kind of prose that was there.
One of the things I think that you responded to that we both loved about the book and actually made it harder in some ways to adapt once we started trying to figure it out is that he doesn't, it's told from a first person perspective, from the son's perspective, but he doesn't ascribe a lot of motivation to any piece of dialogue or any action. Like, the actions stand for themselves, the dialogue stands for himself. Like, one way to say it is there are no adverbs, but there are no metaphorical adverbs either. Like, it's very plain, the writing, and you know, you don't get to know why someone is doing what they're doing or saying what they're saying. Does that?
And not to make it sound overly simple, I find it deeply poetic, that kind of writing. So.
So I want to come back in a little bit to the process and the way the two of you worked together, and some of the ways that you worked within those spaces that you're talking about. He creates in his writing, but I also want to weave in the other films that we're talking about. So I'll go to Debra, and then we'll go to Lynne. I want to start with kind of the same. Give you the chance to answer the same question, and that is the notion, the what might seem to be an inherent challenge in taking and finding another writer's work and making it your own. Is there anything, is that a daunting thing, or is that, how do you view that process? And you work with a co-writer, a collaborator often?
Yeah, I do. You know, it's sort of accepting the huge differences of nuance and showing, not telling, unless you're going to use voiceover, unless you're going to bring over that first person's narration. And you know, so many of the books that I'm attracted to do have first person narration. And they're able to tell you, it's really about how much of the story you're going to be able to put in your film. Because a novel can put so much backstory in. It can put so much spoken insight. And if I'm restricting myself to only showing that, I can't really, in the 90 or 104 minutes, I can't necessarily have, unless I'm going to go into flashbacks or other tropes, which don't come easy to me, I have to say I'm going to be adapting a portion of this novel. And then, similar to something that Paul's saying, is that really getting ahead of time the complete agreement of the author with that. You know, having only working with authors who say, my book is my book, what you make is the next incarnation. It will be quite different, and I'm either braced for that or I've already accepted that.
So maybe give us an early insight into the origins of the project, and how you found the earliest part of it. Maybe the same question I asked Paul and Zoe. And do you remember when you picked up this writing, and do you remember what spoke to you about it, or when it spoke to you, in what way?
In this case, the book was given to me by two producers that had really enjoyed it, and they had spoken to Peter Rock and optioned it, and they were very passionate about it, and they had held it close to their hearts for a long time, and so it was a really awesome invitation to take a look at the book, and I you know, there's a couple of criteria that will always turn me on immediately. You know, a rich location. I love regional filmmaking, so the fact that this was Pacific Northwest, and I got a real whiff early on that this producing team would actually try to locate the film in the Pacific Northwest, not shoot Vancouver for Oregon, and you know, and they were going to try to really preserve these rich, both anthropological and geological details of the book. Then comes meaty roles that make me excited about thinking about an actor getting a chance to step into them. And of course, that would be a particular proclivity would be a meaty role for a female protagonist. Not exclusively, but my eyes always bug a little bit more when I'm like, oh, she's a very interesting person to read about, and I'm curious what she's going to do. I want to follow her, you know. And so, those were the sort of the little buttons that start to go blink, you know. And so, it wasn't my discovery. It was given. It was, you know, shown to me, and. But
you clearly responded to it.
I did. Yeah. I did.
Again, we're going to come back to more about the process. Lynne, kind of the same line of questioning, and I'd love to know about sort of what introduced you to this project, and where you sort of started to dig into it, and why.
Well, first of all, I just want to say how much I agree with both of you guys. You know, if the writer's not, if it's not very clear from the beginning that your film's a very different beast, and you're restricted in that way. I mean, my adaptations, I've done a few now, have been pretty different from the original material, but I think I have the spirit of that material, you know, the best things, hopefully. So very much like Debra, I was sent something. It was a novella. It wasn't even finished. That's the second time I've done that. First, and I have been in a position where I've read something that wasn't finished that became a bestseller. And then that totally changed the whole thing, because it was like the Holy Bible, you know, like you couldn't change anything, and then I just knew I wouldn't be able to make it. But this was just a very spare, it was a genre piece, like it's nothing like I've done before, like a very kind of hard-boiled novella, brilliant writing by a guy called Jonathan Ames, who's a New York writer. I'd read a book he wrote called I Pass Light Night that sort of reminded me of kind of Holden Caulfield gone wrong later on, even more wrong, yeah. And, you know, he's got a lot of humour, but he's also got this very dark side. And, you know, I grew up with these kind of, like, watching a lot of film noir, you know, when I was a kid. My mum loved them. And so to me, it was one of those, I read it in 2 hours, and I was like, and it took the cliches of that kind of trope, this sort of genre, and kind of, it was the character really that brought me in. I think I just always make character studies in the end, even if I think I'm making something different. I thought I was making a thriller or noir, and I made, again, Morven Caller with a guy, which was my thing. Like, you always just get really fixated in, like, you know, with the character pieces. And but yeah, it was a real page turner, and we still wanted it to be a really propulsive, compelling film, but to approach it in a very sort of non-cliche kind of manner. Yeah.
This is a question for any of you that want to dive into it, because I want to maybe help our audience and myself better understand the process of reading something before we talk about the process of writing something. And you've each touched on this in a little bit in the way you've discussed how you responded to the piece that you adapted. But just as a reader, whether it's the first time you read the piece that you've then adapted for the screen, or whether it's further into the process, when do you start seeing it in your mind? Do you need, because you're directing and you're bringing this work from the page to the screen, is it something that speaks to you visually, or that you see early on, or is that part of the process happen later? Maybe each of you have a different way of working too. I'd be curious to know how that works into the process.
I have one image that flashed in my mind, which is just brackets, like my pencil and these brackets around a part of the page that just is a scene right there. Nothing has to be done to it. So
from the book, I see.
Yeah, just like that. That's a great scene, you know, and so it goes as you go through the novel. There's these immediate liftoffs, like where you're just saying, it's just it because the author's written it like a scene. It's cinematic already. And so I read that and I'm like, oh, well, I would certainly need to research that, you know, so like my kind of to-do list kind of starts to germinate on the side of the margin after the scenes. What would it need to actually execute that? How would that be done? I try not to have the production brain going when I'm reading, you know.
Is it hard to turn that off?
Very, very, very.
Because that limits you? Or it might?
Oh, yeah. But for every production blockage or whatever, you try to find a synonym, you know? If there's not going to be a hot springs or a geyser, then there'll be something else that's really modest and actually you can exist. It exists in the woods where you're shooting or something of that nature, you know? So, but yeah, so the gifts from the novel, you kind of harvest those first. I think structure and those other beguiling elements, that, you know, the fact that you now as a translator of this novel and as an adapter, you could restructure. That's the harder, for me, that's always much harder.
What do you guys think?
I actually reconceived my whole final act, you know. We went into prep really quickly. We only very short prep. And then, you know, for what was quite a short script, probably 100 pages. It was like we had 29 days to shoot, and again, a bit like having the producer's hat on, you've got all these obstacles, and I knew I couldn't shoot what I had on the page on that amount of time, you know, like, so some things were reconceived, but then it becomes more creative almost, you know. It's like your back's up against the wall, and then I think suddenly, like, the end never worked for me, and then I found it, yeah, and that was through working with Joaquin as well, but anyway.
That's so interesting. That sounds terrifying.
It was. I was shitting myself.
Yeah. So like I said before, I thought about the book for about a year before I reached out to Richard Ford, and what sort of got me to finally do it was I thought of what the final image of the film was maybe going to be. And once I had this certain scene or image, which is not in the book, but it was what the film was for me, I said, oh shit, okay, I think I can maybe actually do this. And I hadn't written before. So I tried to approach it taking like my naiveness and innocence as a writer as hopefully a good thing. So I really just tried to like turn over in myself, why does this book sort of obsess me, you know, and haunt me a little bit. And so just like a lot of writing that wasn't screenplay writing, just journal and stuff like that, to like stoke any unconscious material before I started writing, but really just trying to like bring myself to it, no matter how the adaptation went. But you know, so then I wrote a first draft, not in screenplay format. That was conscious because I just didn't want to jump to any conclusions either. I was really just trying to like write by, I don't know what, but by the image, and try to understand how one takes internal life and narration and translate it to an image. And so I wrote something that I secretly thought was really good, and then I gave it to Zoe, and she just tore it apart.
Really? You did?
And then,
We didn't
In
even.
what way?
Well, it wasn't a script. You know, it wasn't. So.
So what was it? It was.
It was like. It was like what he saw in his brain. You know, it was the images he saw in his brain, and there would be like scene. Mother, the father, and the son sit at the table. They talk about the weather. Scene, like, you know, and it was like, well, this is not a script. But then there were things, you know, Paul had done a lot of the heavy lifting of like, you know, like he said, he fell in love with this book, and he had me read it to be like, should we option this? Because we optioned it ourselves. We didn't get a producer to do it for us. And I could see reading it why it obsessed him. And he had wanted to make a film for so long, and it felt like this was the right material. When I read what he had written, I thought like, oh, this is, it's like the inside of his head. And we'd been together like, I don't know, 6 years at that point. And, you know, I know the inside of his head really well, so I could see some of what he was seeing, but even I couldn't see all of what he was seeing. So I tried to give him notes, and it became like a very futile exercise. We got like 5 pages into his script, and it was like not good for our relationship. And I was like, well, I think, you know, I had written a screenplay before that we had made together with Jonathan Dayton and Valerie Ferris, and I had written, like, I think at that point 3 plays, and so I had a lot more experience, and I was like, I think you should just let me do a draft of this, and sort of like translate some of what you see in your head and put it into the way so other people can see it. But then when I was doing that, I did a lot of what you were talking about, Debra, of sort of like restructuring. Like, Paul had already pulled all of the treasure from the book, and I actually printed it out and put pages in different parts of the room and looked at it and was like, oh, these things can be consolidated, this can become like one movement, like doing a lot of that. And then we just traded it back and forth. But I had to learn how to see the images that Paul was seeing. Like, it had to become mine as I worked on it. And it was interesting because, you know, we're both actors, and I think we're both used to thinking in somebody else's pictures, like it's part of what we do for a living. And in a weird way, it felt like some meld of the two things for me, of like, I learned to see the film that he saw in his head and learned to like speak in his voice, or the voice that he was trying to speak in that's half his and half Richard Ford's, and then became mine too. But it was just really interesting. I'd never done that before, and neither of us had ever adapted before.
I don't remember read so many. I mean, writing and prep is really hard as well. After I spent years writing this in Santorini, we played in a village with no cars, and then went to New York and freaked out at the sound. Even, you know, like it's, you know, like so you're in this, and then it goes. You know, you write it for. I was the same with my first script as well, Ratcatcher. I was asked to write a treatment for it, right? And I didn't really know what it was BBC. I didn't know what they expected. So I gave him 60 pages, you know, and it was almost a script, but it read like a novel. It was just thoughts in my head and stuff. Luckily, they liked it, so I kind of started in that similar vein, you know. But a lot of it for me as well is trying to translate what your vision is, and I think a lot about sound as well, and work like, you know, just to get, and on the last project, which was a really long novel, we need to talk about Kevin. I mean, we had the budget and then it got cut. I was in New York casting, and then the financial crash happened, and it was like, oh, we're not making it anymore. So I had to reconceive the whole thing and kind of edit on paper. Like every shot went to somewhere to a sound, because it was a lot of different timelines. And I personally hate flashbacks as well. So funnily enough, it's like you're doing these different timelines in this film as well. I had to think about much more a subconscious kind of way of thinking about like a past, you know. Rather than something that's telling you, the audience, so here's what you need to know about this character. But yeah, like that was a real challenge, because it was like, I was like, I've been working on this project for ages. Just because we've got less money means I'm still going to do my damnedest to make it. So I was literally cut and paste and edit and to put that together, you know, because it was a 450 page novel or 570 page script, you know, in the end, or something like that.
It's fascinating to hear the differences and also the similarities in these processes. I would love to ask Debra, picking up on what we've just been talking about, and maybe going back to the notion of collaboration, to what extent does your process with, and I just forget, is it Anne Rossellini?
Yes.
Does it resemble what Paul and Zoe are talking about, or is it totally different from that? Is it?
There are definitely similarities, because you know, she will always be someone who can, at least it's a sounding board for me to, if she doesn't understand why something's in the script, for me to at least pitch it to her, and then for her to be very honest about whether it's, you know, adding something for her or enriching it in any way. And then she's very, we don't do them simultaneously either. So I send her a draft, and she sends me a lot of notes, and we work in that way. And you know, and she's someone that I also work with on casting and locations heavily. Like we scout together, and so a lot. So then what happens is she's someone, after we take tons of photos of the real places, or have met some real characters that we might want to try to work into the story, she knows exactly what I'm talking about and who I'm talking about. So if we've gone to some place and, you know, it called out for a certain location, we found a great location, we were there together, then when I start to describe it in the script, she really knows what it is. And, you know, and then we try very hard to make sure that other people also know why we like it, you know, whatever that location was, or that specific kind of person or animal.
Yeah.
You know?
You mentioned earlier the notion of place, and it's such the places that your films have been set, to me, and I don't know if other folks would agree, but I feel like almost characters within the film, or they're more than characters. They're really like, they really embody not only the characters and the dialogue, but they bring something very specific, and it's hard for me to sort of pinpoint what that is, but I wonder if you're able to pinpoint why that is. Because you said earlier that you think a lot about the place, and in this case, the place kind of jumped out. Have you talked about or thought about why that is such an important part of what intrigues you or motivates you?
Well, I think that leads me to this idea of a crossroads, right? Adaptation plus the real world. So you've inherited or had the option or the opportunity or the great chance to understand and ingest a really finely honed story with a plot and characters and ideas and a place. And then you take that blueprint or that template or that beautiful work. You know, I'm not trying to minimize it. You take the beautiful work, but in terms of, like, if you think about scouting, that's a blueprint. Like I said, okay, they were living in this kind of forest, they were brought into this kind of institution, and they were placed on this kind of farm or this kind of rural setting. So then you have to really go find those, right? You have to go find the forest. Who are you going to find in the forest? You're going to find people who've lived like them or haven't. You're going to find real rangers. You're going to find out about primitive skills. You're going to find out all this real life detail. Same thing in the institution. People are going to school you about what really the caseworker would say. Same thing on the farm. You know, they're going to show you the real details, and the guy on the farm is going to say it better than, you know, any dialogue from real people for me is extremely attractive. And so through an extended dialogue on that scout with the real farmer, I'm going to get that, some of those, he's going to change the scene basically. By telling me sort of how he really does it. I'll say, God, I actually like the way he really does it much more than the sort of, you know, half-baked sketch that I had in my script, you know.
And then you go back and rework?
Yes. So
Is that
visual
during your,
and
sorry, is that during your scout for the actual shooting, or are you doing this like as research for yourself midstream?
research? Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
that's so
yeah.
interesting.
Some of that happens close to shooting, and that's troublesome, you know, because that script has to be communal, and so, you know, amazing things that you're very attracted to are flying into your production very last minute, and that can cause everybody huge stress. But so yes, much better on that. When you're just still, you know, when you're just dreaming, really, right? When you're just like, all we have to do today is go to 6 locations and take as many photographs as we can. But no matter what, someone's going to be there. Even the landowner's going to be there. Right. They're going to be interested. You know, every location's going to give. Yeah, exactly.
That's so interesting.
If this whole festival you were only to see 3 films, you could not go wrong. You would have a great experience seeing these 3 films. And I hope this conversation enriches that experience for you.